Picture the kingpin. The private jet, the sprawling hacienda, the tailored suits, the casual flick of a wrist that dictates life or death for dozens. That image, the one splashed across every B-movie poster and true crime documentary, is perhaps the most expensive piece of corporate marketing ever created. Because what it hides is a business model far more brutal, more complex, and often far less profitable for most of its participants than any legitimate Fortune 500 company. The common belief is simple. A cartel is a money-printing machine, an endless geyser of illicit cash. You just move product, collect stacks of bills, and occasionally eliminate the competition. But that's like saying running Apple is just about selling phones. The reality of owning, or even just operating within, a major cartel is a perverse masterclass in supply chain logistics, human resources management under extreme duress, and risk assessment where failure means not just bankruptcy, but dismemberment. So how does this so-called business actually make money? And what are the hidden costs that nobody talks about? Let's start at the very beginning of the supply chain, which, in the world of illicit narcotics, often means the farmer. You might imagine vast fields of coca or poppies tended by downtrodden peasants, earning next to nothing. And that's largely true, but the economics are far more intricate than simple exploitation. A farmer in Colombia, for instance, might cultivate a hectare of coca, which can yield roughly 250 kilograms of coca leaf every 4 months. From this, they might extract just over 1 kilogram of coca paste. The price? For that kilogram of paste, the farmer might see anywhere from $500 to $900. That's for months of backbreaking labor, constant threat, and living in remote, often dangerous territory. Now, that kilogram of paste isn't going to make it to the streets of Chicago on its own. It needs to be processed into cocaine hydrochloride, the white powder everyone recognizes. This step happens in clandestine labs, often deep in the jungle or tucked away in remote mountains. The people running these labs are taking on far greater risk, handling dangerous chemicals, and requiring a significant investment in equipment and security. The cost to transform that kilogram of paste into a kilogram of finished product can range from a few hundred to over $1,000, depending on the purity and the local cost of precursors. So, our initial 1 kilogram of paste, worth about $800 to the farmer, is now a kilogram of cocaine, which cost another $800 to process, bringing its cost base to roughly $1,600. But the real challenge, and where the true business of a cartel begins, is moving that product. This isn't just about a guy with a backpack. This is an international logistical nightmare. Imagine coordinating thousands of individuals, from mules carrying small quantities across borders to sophisticated maritime operations using semi-submersible vessels to airlifts in small planes. Each step involves payments to the smugglers, to the corrupt officials, to the enforcers who ensure the product isn't stolen by rival gangs or intercepted by authorities. These are not insignificant sums. A single mule might earn a few $1,000s for a high-risk run, while bribing a border agent or port official could cost tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the scale of the operation and the level of official involved. And then there's the tax, the constant demand for tribute from local gangs, rival cartels, and even corrupt police forces. This isn't just about avoiding detection. It's about buying peace, or at least a temporary truce, in a market defined by violence. These protection payments, often a percentage of the shipment's value, can eat into margins significantly. One estimate suggests that up to 25% of the wholesale value of a major drug shipment can be lost to these taxes and bribes before it even reaches its destination country. So, our kilogram of cocaine, which started at $1,600 in production cost, might now be sitting at $5,000 or $6,000 by the time it lands on American soil, just from transport, bribes, and protection. And it hasn't even been cut or distributed yet. This is where the cartel's true operational genius, or perhaps its ultimate vulnerability, comes into play. Because unlike a legitimate business, there are no contracts, no legal recourse, and no insurance. Every single transaction, every single movement is built on a foundation of brutal trust and the implicit threat of violence. And this is precisely why these organizations, despite their apparent power, are so prone to internal collapse. Because when the stakes are literally life and death, and the employees are often just as ruthless as the management, the idea of a stable, long-term business model becomes an oxymoron. So if the costs are so high, the risks so extreme, and the margins for so many so thin, why then do people keep buying into the idea of owning a cartel? The answer lies in the pyramid scheme itself, a structure where the overwhelming majority of risk and minimal profit is pushed down the chain, while an increasingly smaller number of individuals at the top accumulate astronomical wealth. It's not about the farmer in Colombia who, for his 4-month yield of coca leaf, might make a few $100s. His profit margin is dictated by the local cartel's fixed price, often barely enough to sustain his family. He's essentially a contracted laborer, not an entrepreneur. The same applies to the lab operators in the remote jungles or mountains, converting coca paste into pure cocaine hydrochloride. They are paid for their specialized skill, but their piece of the pie is fixed, and their lives are constantly at risk from explosions, chemical burns, or rival takeovers. The true owners, the kingpins, understand that the initial production and local transport are commodity costs, expenses to be managed, not profit centers for anyone but themselves. Their genius, if you can call it that, is in vertical integration. They don't just move the product, they own the product from the moment it leaves the farm, through the labs, across borders, and often all the way to the street distribution networks in cities like Chicago. This comprehensive control allows them to capture the escalating value at each stage. A kilogram of cocaine, which cost them perhaps $6,000 to get onto American soil, is now their inventory. They're not paying a markup to a middleman. They are the middleman and the wholesaler, and often the primary distributor. This is where the pricing really starts to inflate. That $6,000 kilogram, when broken down, cut with other substances to increase volume, a process that can add 20 to 50% more product, and then sold to street dealers, can fetch anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000. This is a massive leap in value, almost entirely captured by the cartel's upper echelons. The street dealer, the final link, might buy a few ounces for a few $1,000s and then sell it in gram or half-gram increments, making a decent living but still operating on the fringes, bearing the immediate risk of arrest or violence. The kingpin, however, sits at the top, dictating terms, controlling supply, and enforcing his will with brutal efficiency. His employees, from the farmers to the enforcers to the corrupt officials, are all part of a vast, illegal enterprise where their loyalty is bought with fear and a share of a pie that shrinks dramatically the further down the hierarchy you go. The dictator of life or death isn't a metaphor. It's a business model. Compliance is guaranteed not by legal contracts, but by the very real threat of violence against anyone who deviates. A mule who loses a shipment, a corrupt official who gets greedy, or an enforcer who fails to protect a load, faces consequences that legitimate businesses simply don't employ. This brutal enforcement eliminates many of the soft costs of traditional business, like HR disputes, legal battles, or even competitive pricing in the traditional sense. The cartel's market dominance is often achieved through intimidation and elimination, not innovation or customer service. So, while the street price in Chicago might be $30,000 for that kilogram, the kingpin's actual cost, having vertically integrated and managed all the intermediate risks, is still closer to the initial 6,000. That's a gross profit of $24,000 per kilogram. Scale that to tons, and you understand the allure, the magnetic pull of this particular brand of illicit enterprise. But this system, for all its ruthless efficiency, is inherently unstable. Because the same lack of legal framework that allows for such brutal control also means there's no protection from it. Every single layer of this operation, from the lowest farmer to the highest-ranking lieutenant, is a potential point of failure, a vector for internal or external attack. A farmer might decide to sell his harvest to a rival cartel for a slightly better price. A lab operator might be raided or his facility sabotaged. A smuggler might be intercepted by an unexpected law enforcement sweep. Or more dangerously, a trusted lieutenant might decide they want to be the new kingpin, leading to internal power struggles that devastate the organization and often claim hundreds of lives in gruesome turf wars. The very tools of control, violence, and intimidation are also the seeds of its destruction. And this is the paradox of owning a cartel. You have absolute power, but also absolute vulnerability. You control everything, but everything is constantly trying to break free or betray you. Your employees are not motivated by stock options or career paths, but by survival and greed, a volatile mix that requires constant, vigilant management. The incessant need for protection payments, the ever-present threat of law enforcement, and the internal machinations of ambitious subordinates mean that maintaining this empire is a perpetual war, an endless drain on resources, both financial and human. It's a business where the only growth strategy is expansion, and the only exit strategy is often death or imprisonment. The illusion of infinite wealth is compelling, but the reality is a constant, brutal battle for control, where the very act of maintaining power consumes an ever-increasing amount of resources, money, and lives. And the cost of that control? It's paid for not just in dollars, but in blood, a currency that eventually runs out for even the most powerful kingpins. The question then becomes, what happens when that control begins to slip, even slightly, and the internal pressures become too great to contain? What happens when the business model itself becomes the biggest threat to its own existence? The answer is simple: chaos. A cartel isn't a corporation with HR policies and employee benefits. It's a hydra, and when one head is threatened, others rise, often from within. When control slips, the employees, from the coca farmer in Colombia harvesting his yield every 4 months, to the lab operators tucked away in remote jungles or mountains, converting paste into pure cocaine, to the mules risking their lives for a few $1,000s, they all start looking for the next best deal. Their loyalty is a transactional commodity, bought with fear and money, and both are finite resources. Consider the economics of a single shipment destined for, say, Chicago. The product passes through a dozen hands, each demanding their cut. The farmer who gets a pittance compared to the street value. The lab operator who invests in chemicals and equipment, constantly under threat of explosion or raid. Then come the smugglers who navigate treacherous routes and bribe corrupt officials at every checkpoint. These officials are not a one-time cost. They are a recurring operational expense, a constant tax on your supply chain. The amount paid to them is never static, always subject to negotiation, threat, or the whims of a new, hungrier official. This isn't just about moving product. It's about managing a shadow bureaucracy of graft and intimidation, an entire parallel state funded by illegal trade. And then there are the enforcers, the muscle. Their job is to ensure the product isn't stolen or intercepted, to collect taxes from local gangs who want a piece of the action, and to deal with rival cartels. These taxes are not fixed. They fluctuate with the perceived strength of your organization, the desperation of the local gang, or the ambition of a rival kingpin. Every single payment, every single bribe, every single protection fee, erodes the profit margin. It's a business model built on extracting value, but also constantly leaking it through 1,000 different holes. The kingpin at the top might see millions, even billions, flowing in, but the true net profit is a fraction of the gross, after paying off everyone from the lowest street thug to the highest-ranking general. The sheer cost of maintaining this network of corruption and violence is staggering. The internal pressures are even more insidious. The very structure designed to protect the cartel, its network of lieutenants, capos, and regional bosses, becomes its greatest weakness. Each of these individuals is a potential rival, a mini kingpin in waiting, watching for any sign of weakness from above. They are constantly testing the boundaries, siphoning off profits, building their own loyal factions. The kingpin's power is absolute, but only as long as it is perceived to be absolute. Any hesitation, any perceived mistake, any dip in the flow of cash, and the vultures begin to circle. This is not a friendly corporate ladder. It is a gladiatorial arena where success means survival and failure means a gruesome end. The paranoia required to survive at the top is a constant, exhausting burden. The cycle of violence, which is initially a tool for control, transforms into an uncontrollable cost. Turf wars with rival cartels are not just about market share. They are existential battles that drain resources, disrupt supply lines, and attract unwanted attention from legitimate law enforcement. Every bullet fired, every body buried, every family avenged is an expense. It's a cost of doing business that traditional companies don't face, and it's a cost that escalates exponentially. The more successful a cartel becomes, the larger its territory, the more valuable its roots, the more intense the competition, and thus the higher the cost of maintaining that dominance. It's a treadmill of bloodshed that only speeds up. The kingpin, once seen as an unassailable dictator of life and death, finds himself trapped in a gilded cage. He must constantly project an image of omnipotence and invincibility because any crack in that facade invites immediate challenge. His personal security costs astronomical sums, his intelligence network must be flawless, and his ability to dispense both reward and brutal punishment must be unwavering. But even the most ruthless kingpin cannot be everywhere at once. He relies on a chain of command, a hierarchy which is inherently unstable. A mid-level operator, perhaps one responsible for a key laboratory in the mountains or a critical smuggling route, might decide that their direct profits could be higher without the kingpin's overhead. Or, more simply, they might be offered a better deal, a promise of protection or a larger share, by a rival. This inherent fragility means the kingpin is always just one betrayal away from total collapse. This isn't just about greed, it's about opportunity cost and risk assessment in an unregulated market. If a farmer can get an extra $20 per kilo of coca paste from a rival, and believes the rival can offer better protection from the existing cartel's retribution, the defection risk increases. If a smuggler sees a chance to cut out the middleman and deal directly with a street distributor in Chicago, the temptation to betray becomes overwhelming. The kingpin's entire enterprise is a house of cards, built on the shifting sands of fear, loyalty, and momentary self-interest. The question is not if it will fall, but when, and how spectacularly. What is the breaking point for such a system, where every solution creates a new, equally dangerous problem? The breaking point is rarely a single dramatic event. Instead, it's a slow, insidious erosion, like rust eating through a steel beam, until one day a seemingly minor tremor brings the whole structure crashing down. It begins with a whisper, a rumor carried on the wind through the remote mountain labs in Colombia, suggesting that the kingpin's grip is not quite as ironclad as it once was. Perhaps a shipment of coca paste, destined for processing, goes missing. Not a huge amount, but enough to trigger suspicion. The enforcers are dispatched, their methods predictably brutal, but the missing product is never found, and the explanation offered is suspiciously vague. This small failure, this unpunished theft, cracks the facade of omnipotence. Operators in charge of critical routes, the ones who move the product across borders, start to question the security they're paying for. If the kingpin cannot even secure his own supply chain in the mountains, how can he protect a large consignment heading towards Chicago? This doubt is a virus, and it spreads rapidly. A rival cartel, always lurking in the shadows, waiting for just such a sign of weakness, capitalizes immediately. They approach a key smuggler, perhaps one responsible for a route through Central America, not with threats, but with an offer. A higher percentage, direct protection from the rival's enforcers, and a promise of stability that the current kingpin seems to be losing. The smuggler, assessing the immediate risk versus the potential reward, makes a calculated decision. One critical shipment, perhaps worth several $1 million on the street, is diverted. It disappears from the kingpin's network and resurfaces days later, sold under a rival's flag. This is not a whisper. This is a shout. The kingpin's response must be swift, decisive, and terrifying. He orders immediate retribution, targeting not just the defecting smuggler, but their entire family, anyone associated. This is the solution, the brutal enforcement of loyalty through fear. But this very act, meant to restore order, only accelerates the collapse. The sheer scale of the violence required to punish one defection sends shockwaves through the entire organization. Corrupt officials, who once accepted their monthly payments with quiet satisfaction, now see the instability. They recognize that a kingpin at war is a kingpin distracted, and a distracted kingpin is vulnerable to law enforcement. So, they begin to hedge their bets, leaking information, allowing minor busts to occur as a show of good faith to the authorities, while still playing both sides. The cost of bribes escalates as their risk perception increases. The kingpin, once the ultimate authority, now finds himself negotiating with his own paid protection. The chaos intensifies. Farmers, who once sold their coca leaves every 4 months to the kingpin's buyers, now face a dilemma. Do they stay loyal to a collapsing power, risking their lives in the crossfire? Or do they accept the slightly lower but more reliable payment from the rival cartel now asserting its dominance? The supply chain, the very lifeblood of the cartel, begins to fray at the edges. Laboratories in the remote jungles, once humming with activity, become targets in the escalating turf war. The kingpin's enforcers are stretched thin, fighting battles on multiple fronts against rival cartels, against defectors, and increasingly against a law enforcement system finally able to exploit the internal strife. The gilded cage has become a burning prison. The kingpin, once orchestrating a complex economic empire, is now simply fighting for survival, trapped by the very monster he created. And as the smoke clears, a new question emerges. Will there be anything left to control? The question hangs heavy in the air. Will there be anything left to control? The answer, ironically, is yes, but it won't be his to control. The market, a relentless, indifferent entity, always finds a way. As one kingpin falls, another rises, often from the very ranks of the defectors or rival gangs who exploited the chaos. The infrastructure, clandestine labs in remote mountains, corrupted officials, desperate farmers in Colombia harvesting coca leaves every 4 months. Mules, smugglers, enforcers, they don't simply vanish. They adapt, they pivot. They find a new boss, a new paymaster, a new banner. The cartel, as a corporate entity, might be decapitated, but its economic functions are merely transferred, like a virus mutating to find a new host. The kingpin, should he survive the internal purge and state pursuit, now faces a stark choice: flee with whatever illicit gains he squirreled away, or face inevitable capture, or worse. For a man who built an empire on fear and absolute control, a life in hiding, constantly looking over his shoulder, is its own kind of prison. His retirement package often involves a lengthy stay in a high-security prison or a shallow grave in the jungle. A grim reminder that in this business, the only truly secure asset, your life, is a highly volatile commodity. The illusion of untouchable power dissolves into isolation and betrayal. The very mechanisms of enforcement he perfected are now turned against him by his successors or by the state. What remains is not a cleaned-up market, but a restructured one. Prices might fluctuate briefly as supply lines are re-established or new players assert dominance. For the end user in Chicago, the product might be slightly scarcer or more expensive for a few weeks, perhaps even less pure, but demand persists, unyielding, ensuring the illicit trade's economic engine churns. The cost of doing business has fundamentally shifted. The new kingpin, having learned from his predecessor's downfall, might implement even more brutal loyalty tests, demand higher tribute from farmers, or diversify into other illicit streams to mitigate risk. The lessons learned are rarely about ethics. They are always about control, efficiency, and profit margins where human lives are merely inputs and outputs on a ledger. So, the economics of owning a cartel are not about building a sustainable long-term enterprise. They are about managing an inherently unstable, self-cannibalizing system. It is a business model built on the premise that violence is a scalable solution to every problem, a belief that inevitably leads to its own undoing. Every successful expansion increases the surface area for attack. Every act of intimidation breeds resentment. Every display of power invites a stronger challenge. The kingpin's ultimate product isn't cocaine or heroin. It's a temporary monopoly on terror, a fleeting moment of absolute command before the next wave of ambitious, ruthless entrepreneurs comes to claim their share. The real lesson, then, isn't how to run such a business, but why it can never truly be owned. It's an entity that consumes its creators, a hydra that grows new heads for everyone cut off. It's a market that thrives on desperation and exploits every crack in the legal economy, a mirror reflecting society's shadows. It begs the question, if the economic drivers of these cartels are so resilient, what truly needs to change for the cycle to finally break? Share your thoughts below on the systemic changes you believe could disrupt this relentless market.